Power does not announce itself. It does not seek permission, and it rarely explains its intentions. Power observes quietly, studies human weakness, measures opportunity, and when the moment is right, it acts with precision. 500 years ago, one man dared to describe power exactly as it is, not as religion preached it, not as morality demanded it, but as human behavior revealed it. His name was Niccolò Machiavelli. To some, he was immoral, to others, dangerously honest. But to history, Machiavelli became the thinker who exposed the true psychology behind power, leadership, and control. He did not write about heroes or ideals. He wrote about fear, ambition, and survival. Today, when leaders manipulate public opinion, when fear outweighs loyalty, and when ambition silences morality, we are still living in Machiavelli's world. His ideas continue to echo because they describe something timeless, how people behave when authority is at stake. This is not a story about good and evil, nor a defense of cruelty. It is a study of human nature under pressure, where power reveals who we truly are. To understand Machiavelli is to confront an uncomfortable truth. Power does not reward virtue alone. It rewards understanding. And that is why his philosophy remains as relevant now as it was centuries ago. This is Machiavelli, and this is the psychology of power explained. To understand Machiavelli, it is necessary to understand the world that shaped him, a world defined not by stability or moral certainty, but by constant danger, shifting loyalties, and ruthless ambition. Niccolò Machiavelli was born into Renaissance Italy, a land fragmented into competing city-states where power was seized, not inherited, and survival depended on calculation rather than virtue. Florence, his home, appeared refined and cultured on the surface, yet beneath its art and beauty lay a brutal political reality, where betrayal was expected, alliances were temporary, and violence was an accepted instrument of rule. Machiavelli served as a diplomat and civil servant, observing rulers up close as they negotiated, deceived, threatened, and manipulated in order to maintain control. He watched leaders who relied on honesty and goodwill fall quickly, while those who mastered fear and perception endured. This was not abstract philosophy for him, but lived experience. When the Medici family reclaimed power in Florence, Machiavelli was accused of conspiracy, imprisoned, tortured, and eventually exiled. Stripped of position and influence, he was forced to confront power from the outside, to study why some men survived chaos while others were destroyed by it. From this isolation, Machiavelli began to analyze authority not as it should be, but as it truly operated in a world governed by insecurity and ambition. The environment that produced him was unforgiving, and it demanded clarity over comfort. In such a world, illusions were dangerous, and only those who understood human behavior could endure. Renaissance Italy did not merely influence Machiavelli's thinking, it compelled it, forging a perspective rooted in realism, survival, and psychological insight. It was within this harsh political landscape that the foundations of the psychology of power were formed, setting the stage for ideas that would unsettle the world for centuries to come. Power and morality have never been comfortable companions. Long before Machiavelli put his thoughts to paper, rulers were praised for virtue while quietly punished for weakness. Society admired moral leadership in theory, yet rewarded effectiveness in practice. Machiavelli was the first to say this openly. He did not argue that morality was meaningless. He argued that morality alone was insufficient when survival, authority, and control were at stake. In his most controversial work, The Prince, Machiavelli wrote words that would echo for centuries. He observed that a ruler must learn how not to be good, and to use that knowledge when circumstances demand it. This was not a call to cruelty for its own sake. It was a recognition of how people actually behave under pressure. Machiavelli understood that leadership exists in an imperfect world, filled with fear, ambition, betrayal, and uncertainty. In such a world, strict moral purity can become a liability rather than a strength. Machiavelli saw that people judge leaders not by their intentions, but by their outcomes. A ruler who is moral but loses power is remembered as weak. A ruler who is ruthless but victorious is remembered as strong. This is not because people admire cruelty, but because they fear instability more than injustice. Order, even when harsh, feels safer than chaos. From a psychological perspective, this reveals a fundamental truth about human nature. People value security above virtue when they feel threatened. He also recognized that morality is often flexible when power is involved. Actions condemned in private are excused in public when they succeed. Violence, deception, and manipulation are forgiven when they bring stability, prosperity, or national survival. Machiavelli did not invent this reality. He simply described it without illusion. He understood that power operates according to psychological rules, not moral ideals, and that those who ignore these rules place themselves at risk. For Machiavelli, the greatest danger was not immorality, but naivete. A ruler who believes others will behave ethically simply because it is right is vulnerable to those who do not share that belief. Power, in his view, requires awareness. Awareness of fear, of desire, of how easily people can be influenced by appearances. A leader who refuses to adapt to these realities may remain virtuous, but will likely lose everything. This separation between personal morality and political necessity is what made Machiavelli so disturbing. He forced people to confront the uncomfortable idea that good intentions do not guarantee good outcomes. Leadership, he believed, is judged by survival and stability, not by moral purity. To preserve power, a ruler must sometimes choose a lesser evil, even if that choice damages their reputation. Machiavelli did not celebrate this reality. He accepted it. He understood that power exists in a world where people are inconsistent, emotional, and driven by fear as much as reason. In such a world, morality becomes a tool rather than a foundation. It can be displayed when useful and set aside when dangerous. This is not idealism. It is psychological realism. This is why Machiavelli continues to unsettle modern audiences. His ideas force us to question whether moral leadership is truly possible in environments shaped by competition, ambition, and threat. He reminds us that power does not operate in a vacuum of ideals, but in the complex, often uncomfortable landscape of human behavior. In separating power from morality, Machiavelli was not destroying ethics. He was exposing the cost of ignoring psychology. He showed that leaders who fail to understand how people actually think and behave will be overtaken by those who do. Power, in the end, does not belong to the most virtuous, but to the most aware. And this awareness, more than morality or cruelty, is what defines the psychology of power. Machiavelli, The Psychology of Power Explained. Part 4 few questions in political thought have provoked as much discomfort as the one posed by Niccolò Machiavelli. Is it better for a ruler to be loved or feared? At first glance, the question seems simple, even moral. Yet Machiavelli understood that beneath it lies a deeper psychological reality about how human beings respond to authority. His answer was precise and unsettling. Ideally, a ruler should be both loved and feared, but if one must be chosen, fear is safer. This was not a rejection of love, nor a glorification of cruelty. It was an observation rooted in how emotions function under pressure. Love, Machiavelli observed, is sustained by personal bonds, gratitude, and hope. Fear, by contrast, is sustained by consequence, and consequences are more reliable than feelings. Human affection fluctuates with circumstance, mood, and self-interest, while fear remains stable as long as the threat behind it is credible. Machiavelli understood that when conditions worsen, loyalty based on affection dissolves quickly, but obedience rooted in fear often strengthens. From a psychological perspective, this insight aligns with the human tendency to avoid loss more strongly than to pursue reward. People may admire a kind ruler, but they will test that kindness. They will push boundaries, demand more, and assume tolerance. Fear, when controlled and predictable, creates limits that are rarely crossed. Machiavelli did not advocate terror or random violence. He warned against it. Uncontrolled fear leads to hatred, and hatred breeds rebellion. What he described instead was disciplined fear, fear that is impersonal, consistent, and tied to clear rules. When people understand the cost of disobedience and believe that costs will be enforced, they regulate themselves. Love, by contrast, invites emotional negotiation. It asks people to act against their self-interest out of loyalty, something Machiavelli knew could not be sustained indefinitely. He also recognized that love binds a ruler to the goodwill of others, placing power in fragile hands. Fear places power firmly in the structure of authority. Yet Machiavelli was careful to draw a boundary. A ruler must avoid being hated. Hatred destroys the stability that fear seeks to protect. The psychology here is subtle. Fear restrains behavior, but hatred motivates action. A feared ruler maintains order. A hated ruler invites resistance. Machiavelli understood that effective power exists in this narrow space, where fear enforces obedience without provoking revenge. His insight reveals a deep understanding of emotional regulation at scale. Governing large populations requires emotions that are predictable, not passionate. Love is intense but unstable. Fear is cold but consistent. This is why Machiavelli believed fear was safer, not because it was superior, but because it was dependable. In modern terms, he recognized that authority functions best when it does not rely on personal affection, but on systems, expectations, and consequences. This idea continues to challenge us because it contradicts how we wish leadership worked. We prefer to believe that kindness inspires loyalty, that goodness earns obedience. Machiavelli did not deny this ideal. He simply observed that when survival, power, and uncertainty collide, human behavior follows a different logic. In exposing this logic, he forced future generations to confront an uncomfortable truth. Power is not sustained by what people feel in their best moments, but by how they react in their worst. And it is within the psychological reality, not moral aspiration, that authority truly endures. One of the most misunderstood aspects of Machiavelli's thinking is not his acceptance of cruelty, but his understanding of appearance. Niccolò Machiavelli recognized that power is rarely judged by inner character. It is judged by what people believe they see. In his view, most people do not experience rulers directly. They experience symbols, stories, rituals, and carefully constructed images. From this observation emerged one of Machiavelli's most unsettling insights. A ruler does not need to be virtuous, but must appear virtuous. This was not cynicism for its own sake. It was psychological realism. Humans respond more strongly to perception than to truth, and they form judgments quickly, often without evidence. A leader who looks merciful is assumed to be kind. A leader who looks decisive is assumed to be strong. And a leader who looks moral is trusted, even when their actions contradict that image. Machiavelli understood that virtue, when performed convincingly, becomes a tool of control. Public morality reassures people, reduces resistance, and creates emotional loyalty, while private calculation allows power to be maintained. He observed that rulers who relied solely on genuine goodness often failed, because they underestimated how easily appearances could be manipulated by rivals. In contrast, those who mastered the performance of virtue gained time, obedience, and legitimacy. This illusion did not require constant deception. It required consistency. People forgive occasional contradictions if the overall image remains intact. From a psychological perspective, this reflects a human need for coherence. Once people believe a ruler is just or righteous, they unconsciously reinterpret evidence to protect that belief. Machiavelli recognized this bias centuries before modern psychology named it. He also understood that moral reputation acts as a shield. A ruler known for virtue can commit harsh acts with less backlash, because those acts are seen as necessary exceptions rather than reflections of character. In this way, virtue becomes not a moral anchor, but a strategic asset. Machiavelli did not suggest abandoning ethics entirely. He suggested understanding how ethics function in the minds of the public. He knew that people desire leaders who appear trustworthy more than leaders who actually are. This insight is uncomfortable because it forces us to admit that sincerity alone does not inspire loyalty. Belief does. The illusion of virtue, once established, becomes self-sustaining, shaping how actions are interpreted and remembered. Machiavelli saw that power survives not by being morally pure, but by being psychologically intelligent. Leaders who ignore this reality often fall not because they are wrong, but because they are naive. In revealing the illusion of virtue, Machiavelli exposed a deeper truth about human nature. People do not follow goodness. They follow confidence wrapped in moral symbols. And it is within the space between appearance and reality that power quietly secures itself. Cruelty is the word most often associated with Machiavelli, yet it is also the word most often misunderstood. Niccolò Machiavelli did not argue that cruelty should be embraced, nor did he admire violence for its own sake. What he analyzed was how cruelty functions psychologically when power is at risk. His conclusion was unsettling but precise. Cruelty, when necessary, must be used decisively, sparingly, and at the correct moment. Prolonged or repeated cruelty breeds resentment, hatred, and instability. Swift and limited cruelty, by contrast, shocks the system once and allows order to take root. Machiavelli understood that humans adapt quickly to new realities. When harsh actions are concentrated and then cease, people recalibrate their expectations and move forward. When cruelty drags on, uncertainty grows, fear becomes personal, and resistance begins to organize. At the heart of this idea is timing. Machiavelli believed that power is not only about what is done, but when it is done. Early severity, followed by restraint, creates predictability. Late severity, especially after promises of leniency, feels like betrayal. Psychologically, people tolerate pain more easily than unpredictability. They can accept loss if it feels final, but they rebel against suffering that seems endless. Control, therefore, is not achieved through constant force, but through the perception that force is controlled. Machiavelli recognized that authority weakens when punishment appears emotional or inconsistent. A ruler who punishes out of anger appears unstable, and instability invites challenge. In contrast, punishment that appears calculated and impersonal reinforces the idea that power is structural, not personal. This distinction matters deeply to human psychology. People resist individuals, but they submit to systems. Machiavelli's insight here anticipates modern understandings of institutional power, where rules, not personalities, govern behavior. He also warned that cruelty must never be taken lightly, because its psychological cost is real. Every act of violence creates memory, and memory shapes loyalty. That is why he insisted that cruelty be limited in scope and purpose, used to secure authority rather than to express dominance. When cruelty becomes habitual, it loses its deterrent effect and turns into hatred. Hatred erodes legitimacy, and legitimacy is the invisible foundation of power. Machiavelli's realism lay in his refusal to pretend that power could be maintained without force, but also in his refusal to believe that force alone could sustain it. Control emerges from balance, from knowing when to act and when to stop. Timing, in this sense, is the highest form of intelligence. It requires understanding fear, patience, and the emotional thresholds of a population. A ruler who acts too softly invites disorder. A ruler who acts too harshly invites rebellion. Effective power exists in the narrow space between these extremes. Machiavelli's lesson was not about cruelty itself, but about restraint. True control is not loud. It is measured, deliberate, and strategic. By framing cruelty as a tool of last resort rather than a constant method, Machiavelli revealed a deeper psychological truth. Power is most stable when it is felt rarely, remembered clearly, and feared just enough to discourage challenge. In this way, cruelty becomes not a symbol of dominance, but a signal that authority exists, has limits, and will be enforced only when necessary. This is the uncomfortable realism at the core of Machiavelli's thinking, and it is why his ideas continue to resonate in every system where control, fear, and order intersect. For Niccolò Machiavelli, power was never exercised in a stable or predictable world. He believed that much of life is governed by what he called fortune, chance, chaos, and forces beyond human control. Wars erupt without warning, alliances collapse overnight, and events unfold that no leader can fully anticipate. Yet Machiavelli did not see fortune as destiny. He saw it as a test. While fortune shapes circumstances, he argued, it does not excuse passivity. The true measure of power lies in how leaders respond to uncertainty. Machiavelli compared fortune to a violent river that floods unpredictably. When unprepared, people are swept away. When prepared, they build barriers and channels that limit the damage. Psychologically, this reflects a crucial insight. Humans fear chaos more than hardship, and leaders who appear prepared inspire confidence even when outcomes are uncertain. Machiavelli believed that great rulers do not wait for fortune to strike. They anticipate it. They act decisively in calm times, strengthen institutions, secure loyalty, and reduce dependence on luck. Those who rely on fortune alone may rise quickly, but they fall just as fast when conditions change. Control, in Machiavelli's view, is not the elimination of risk, but the reduction of vulnerability. He emphasized adaptability, the ability to change methods as circumstances change. A leader who succeeds through caution may later need boldness. One who rises through force may later require restraint. This flexibility is psychological, not merely strategic. It requires self-awareness, emotional control, and the willingness to abandon habits that no longer serve power. Machiavelli understood that many leaders fail not because fortune turned against them, but because they refuse to adjust their behavior. They cling to familiar methods, even when reality demands change. From a psychological perspective, this is the danger of ego. Leaders begin to believe their success is proof of correctness rather than circumstance. When fortune shifts, ego prevents adaptation and power collapses. Machiavelli warned that fortune favors those who are prepared to act decisively when opportunity appears, but punishes those who mistake luck for skill. Control, therefore, is not about dominance over events, but mastery over oneself. A ruler who understands fortune understands limitation, and a ruler who understands limitation plans accordingly. In this balance between chaos and control, Machiavelli revealed a timeless truth. Power does not belong to those who are most fortunate, but to those who are most adaptable. And in a world ruled by uncertainty, adaptability is the highest form of strength. More than 5 centuries after his death, Niccolò Machiavelli remains unsettlingly relevant. Not because the world has become more cruel, but because human psychology has remained largely unchanged. The structures of power may look different today. Governments are larger, corporations more complex, and communication faster. But the emotional forces that drive authority are the same. Fear, ambition, insecurity, desire for status, and the need for control continue to shape how people lead and how others follow. Machiavelli's relevance lies in his refusal to romanticize power. He understood that influence operates through perception, that loyalty is conditional, and that stability often matters more to people than justice. In modern politics, leaders still cultivate appearances of strength and virtue, manage fear during crises, and justify harsh decisions in the name of order or security. In corporations, executives make strategic sacrifices, control narratives, and balance popularity against authority. Even in social hierarchies, individuals gain influence not by moral perfection, but by understanding how others think and react. Machiavelli described these dynamics without technology, polling, or modern psychology, yet his observations align closely with what behavioral science would later confirm. Humans are not purely rational, nor consistently moral, especially under pressure. His ideas endure because they explain patterns people recognize but rarely admit. We see leaders praised for decisiveness even when decisions cause harm, and we see compassion questioned when it appears to threaten strength. We watch public opinion shift not with facts alone, but with emotion, symbolism, and narrative. Machiavelli helps us understand why this happens. He shows that power survives by managing expectations, fear, and belief, not by appealing to idealism. Importantly, his relevance is not limited to those who seek power. It extends to those who live under it. To read Machiavelli is to become more aware of manipulation, to recognize when virtue is performed rather than practiced, and to see how authority maintains itself through psychology rather than force alone. His work acts as a mirror, reflecting uncomfortable truths about leadership and followership alike. In this sense, Machiavelli is not teaching people how to dominate, but how domination works. That is why his ideas continue to be taught, debated, and feared. They strip away comforting illusions and replace them with clarity. In a world where influence is subtle and power often hides behind language and image, Machiavelli remains relevant because he teaches us how to see. And once power is seen clearly, it can no longer operate unnoticed. In the end, Niccolò Machiavelli was not asking the world to become cruel, nor was he celebrating manipulation. He was asking us to see power without illusion. He understood that leadership exists in a fragile space where fear, ambition, and uncertainty constantly collide, and where moral intentions alone cannot protect authority from collapse. Machiavelli's greatest contribution was not a set of rules, but a lens, a way of understanding how power behaves when human nature is placed under pressure. He showed that power rewards awareness more than virtue, adaptability more than consistency, and perception more than truth. This does not mean that ethics are meaningless. It means they are vulnerable in environments shaped by competition and fear. Machiavelli forces us to confront an uncomfortable realization. Many of the systems we live within operate not on ideals, but on psychological realities. Leaders rise because they understand these realities, and leaders fall when they ignore them. Yet this understanding is not only for rulers. It is for citizens, observers, and anyone who wishes to recognize influence when it appears disguised as virtue. To study Machiavelli is to gain clarity, not corruption. To see how fear is managed,